All right, good morning, everyone. I'm going to start promptly because we have so much to discuss in so little time, but welcome everybody to this Annulet roundtable called American, quote-unquote, Poetry and Poetics from 2008 to 2025. I'm just going to read all of the questions, and I'm Alicia, right, I'm the editor of Annulet. I'm going to read all of the questions most of the questions I propose as part of a call for this folio, which we'll be publishing in the next issue of Annulet, coming up soon. I need to give everyone their edits first. And then our panelists will take it from there. So for this roundtable, and everyone is invited to, there'll be time for others' participation in the end. Contributors to our spring folio will present talks at detail and open up their individual and collaboratively authored contributions for discussion, which will also welcome y'all into the conversation. Presentations respond to the foundational question driving the folio, which is, what is the history of American poetry and poetics in this period from the 2008 recession to the present, and why isn't there yet a clear understanding of it? Our conversation will address how we might begin to attend to the past 17 years of influences and trends in poetics, or critical theory's application to or interpretation of poetry, as we consider whether there have been significant publishing outlets or networks, or noteworthy affects and affinities particular to this time period. We will also consider what holdovers may continue from previous aesthetic groupings or movements, and whether these legacies are still operative or intact. As part of our conversation, we'll also discuss which forms of poetics, practices, or methods are cresting or have waned, and which poets or methods might currently be ascendant, maybe. We can all suggest what we think is happening in that part of the conversation. Finally, we'll include discussions of presses, journals, and other social forms and solidarities which will or should define the post-recession years until today. Further questions we'll pose to everyone include, but are not limited to, can it be said that there are generational traits or intergenerational aesthetic links that have developed in the past decade and a half? Which figures have defined their respective traditions or their own oeuvres? Whose influence do you suggest will become increasingly ascendant? We can't possibly cover all of this. So, and I'll just read to you the presenters' names in order of their presentations. So Dara Barwa-Dixon, Brian, Toby Altman, Kai Eames, and Laura Farmia will each present variations of their papers or essays, which are all brilliant and amazing, and they're just a selection of a broader number of people who are participating in the folio here with us today. And so I'm just going to get out of the way and let us commence with Dara Barwa-Dixon.
Hi, welcome. Good to see everybody. So here I go. Eventually, I'm going to talk about chapbooks, and I'm going to tell a story, and I'm going to tell it slant about what it was like to write, read, watch, see, hear, and think through poetry where I was living in the wilds of Western Massachusetts from around 1985 to past 2020 and beyond. I'm still living there, and everything has changed. I hope it'll be understood that some dates can't be strictly understood. It'd be like trying to mark off a section of the river and lift it out of its banks. I'm going to start with two poems from people who wrote and lived in the area that I'm talking about over the years. One is James Tate, and the other, the gadfly poet about town, Emily Dickinson. I'll start with Emily Dickinson, and it goes, I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a doom kept beating till I thought, my mind is going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul. And with those boots of lead again, then space began to toll. And all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear. And I in silence, some strange race wreaked havocs and solitary here. And then a plank and reason broke, and I dropped down and hit a world at every plunge and finished knowing then. And the poem by James Tate, who lived and worked in this area that I'm talking about forever, is called Rapture. And that poem goes, if you sit here a long time and are real quiet, you just might get to see one of those blue antelope, I said to Cora. I'd do anything to see a blue antelope, she said. I'd take off all my clothes and lie completely still in the grass all day. That's a good idea, I said, taking off the clothes. It's more natural. I'd met Cora in the library the night before and had told her about the blue antelope. And we'd made a date to try and see them today. We lay naked next to one another for hours. It was a beautiful sunny day with a breeze that tickled. Finally, Cora whispered into my ear, my God, I see them. They're so delicate, so graceful. They're angels, cornflower angels. I looked at Cora. She was disappearing. She was becoming one of them. So, let's see what happens now. My skill set in talking about poetry usually consists of metaphor, analogy, paradox, and peripheral and parallel vision. I can do irony, but only with the expectation that it insists on absolute tragedy. Maybe something involving killing your father and sleeping with your mother and stabbing your eyes out so that your rage and consequential tragic self-inflicted blindness makes its point. I like irony when it's necessary. The other kind is something else, probably something related to a kind of uncanny coincidence or an instance of perverse serendipity. Maybe we're living through the tail end of something we could consider calling the slow burn of misappropriated irony. A few uncanny coincidences has led me here to be here today to talk about this little place in the United States. I like to think about how it is that any place can be a place for any art to deliver people's souls. Poetry can be alive anywhere. It is too everywhere, too necessary, too ready and willing and able to exist in the least friendly circumstances, and able to thrive and heal, uplift and transform wherever and whenever it is called upon to do so. And don't let anyone tell you it does nothing and it can't change lives. I've politely painted myself into a corner. To help me out, my friend said, I bet Ian Fishman would know how to write about the poetry and poets and people associated with what some have called, and this is going to hurt me a lot, they called it Western Massachusetts surrealism. At the time, I didn't know Ian Fishman. A good part of this kind of conscription is that anyone, anywhere who loves writing poetry, its spirit, its soul, its fuel, its transport, the divinity, can say the same thing about their place, themselves, their times, because it's all poetry. I'm not co-author of Fishman's contribution. Let's say his car's racing around an Indy 500 track, and I'm the person in the pit carrying water to the mechanics. Here's Fishman in first person saying what he says about the lines he's found in this world of poetry he's isolated to care about and talk about. And it's a mix of lines from poems, from chapbooks he's collected over a few years, and his own observations that are generalizations. I like in the next life to have most of the same attributes. When I think about everything I've found, I can't help but want to name it. Anaphora, anachronisms, parataxes, elisions, digressions, everyday beauty, not overanalyzed, animals, crickets everywhere, colors. I feel the silver leaking through my feet. Food, machines, knowledge that to live in the universe is to understand there are things we cannot know, a warmth and forlorn essence, loneliness, neighbors, historical figures, extraterrestrials, weird dreaming. 9 people are writing the definitive book on it now. Prose poems, collage, good and bad movies, offbeat Americana, childhood, cities and towns, little mountains, barns, rivers, the uncanny, horrific, gothic, scary, domestic, quotidian, exuberance, what cannot be found, or what we find, trying to find what cannot be found. It's tempting to want these poets to be a part of a school or a scene, but it isn't true. It's too varied, and many of the writers have come and gone. They've come from other places, birds from other area codes, sang their Precambrian songs. Some stay, some go, they all bring something with them, and those things stay. Meanwhile, Fishman was also producing his own version of a hit-and-miss oral history by seeking out and finding living poets who might shed their story or shred their story on his voracious mission. Every friendship, every crossroad delighted him. Every overlapping association thrilled him. All this gets to be infectious. At our last visit, he had acquired 2 more boxes of chapbooks. I watched his eagerness and his surprise and excitement. Sometimes he read me a poem, sometimes I'd read him a poem. Sometimes he asked the questions, sometimes I could answer them. An electrician said to me one day, after a long day at his rewiring much of my old house, he said, you know, the farther away from the source of power you live, the longer your light bulbs will last. That's pretty much sums up the life of chapbooks. From the sources of power, and therefore they are free to be loose with their unpin-downable features. Less conventional in their manners, they are not in the competition business. They tend to do everything they can to support one another's being and encourage one another to be as various as possible. They make poems that make more poems possible. Thank you.
My contribution to Annulet's folio is called Post-Crisis to Assemblage Poetics, which reconstructs contexts from my activity as a poet, editor, and theorist from 2008 to the present. It's in 4 parts. Orange Cell, a magazine I edited from 2011 to 2017. Post-Crisis Poetics, a concept I named in 2013, emphasizing the 2008 economic crisis. The Totality Cantos, my book published by Atelos in 2022, and Assemblage Poetics, my current concept that I first named through writing the Totality Cantos. Orange Cell emerged from multiple influences, including history, especially the 2008 economic crisis, political struggles, especially the California university struggles that began in 2009, literary history, especially language writings magazines, and connecting writers toward constructing radical poetics, and the San Francisco Bay Area poetry community, where I'm from. Orange Cell's first poem was David Lau's Communism Today, which I chose for taking the California university struggles as its context, including the student slogan, Occupy Everything, preserved in its emergence before the start of the Occupy Wall Street movement the next month, which was influenced by the California university struggles. For Orange Cell 5, I analyzed communism today, leading to my first naming and defining of post-crisis poetics. Post-crisis poetics organizes materials that can be useful for immediate struggles and in combination with materials to be produced in the struggles to come. I developed post-crisis poetics through editing my magazine and analyzing writing from it, leading to my essay, Post-Crisis Poetics, in Ormsel 10, further defining it as a desire for a poetics adequate to the present, the world since the 2008 economic crisis, which analyzed David Lau, Joseph Kaplan, me, Stephen Zoltansky, Maya Weeks, Wendy Trevino and Derek Clemens, Jasper Burns, Joshua Clover, Anne Leslie Seltzer, and Rob Halpern. The first poems in Ormsel's issues 1 through 9, and my work in Ormsel 2. My essay was followed by a series that I edited 25 writers, developing post-crisis poetics further, after which I decided to end Ormsel to focus on writing the totality cantos. I conceived the poem in 2011. The 2008 economic crisis and global backdrop of struggles by that year renewed possibilities for thinking totality, materializing it for apprehension and questioning how it could be reassembled otherwise. I wrote the poem from the desire to be interested in everything, open to the totality of discourses. After hearing me read from the poem in 2013, Lynn Haginian invited me to contribute to her Atelos publishing project and published it in 2022. Writing the poem led to my first naming of assemblage poetics in my work. Assemblage poetics, constructive verse, writing adequate to apprehending totality. I wrote an essay called Assemblage Poetics in order to develop this poetics further. Assemblage poetics is concerned with how things and words may connect, how assemblages and practices that articulate them may connect, a collective project for reassembling totality. I analyzed practices by me, Caleb Beckwith, AJ Carruthers, Tom Comita, Alex Cruz, Paul Ebenkamp, Angela Hume, Harry Hunter, Michael Leon, and Divya Victor that I saw doing assemblage poetics. Other than me, a different group of people than those I analyzed in post-crisis poetics. My essay was followed by a collection called Assemblage Sampler that I edited of 14 contributors, developing this poetics further. In both constructing texts and social formations of practices, assemblage poetics is a practical poetics, considering how words and practices affect each other, how they may increase possibilities for making sense. I see a continuing task to assemble a global critical poetics, connecting critical discourses and practices dispersed in totality, which I see potentials for in this folio and this festival, in order to construct assemblages to face contingencies and transformations, both locally and globally, now and to come.
Hello, everyone. How's everybody doing? Good, good. Thanks for being here this morning. You can think of this paper that I'm going to present kind of like a bread sandwich, you know, like it's 2 slices of bread with nothing in the middle. By which I mean that my essay for Annulet is a big, long mess, and I'm just going to read the introduction and like 1 paragraph of the conclusion, and you'll just have to imagine like all the yummy meat in between. It's called After the Poetry Wars. In my essay for Annulet's folio, I try to answer a deceptively simple question. Is the poetry of this century different from that of the last? After 25 years, we ought to be able to make some rough guesses about where we are and where we're going. I say that the question is deceptively simple because I don't think it yields a simple answer. If anything, the poetry of the past 30-odd years has been engaged in a prolonged negotiation with the legacies of the 20th century, reevaluating its conceptual categories and repurposing its major innovations. If we have arrived at the end of that process in some place new, that arrival has happened only through an intensive and ongoing engagement with the past that it supplants. The central task of my essay, then, is simply to describe the changes that have occurred in poetry over the past 30 years. But that task, too, is deceptively simple. One of the telling patterns in recent poetic discourse is a struggle to name the changes that scholars and poets see happening around them. In her 2009 introduction to American Hybrid, for instance, Cole Swenson writes, quote, "American poetry finds itself at a moment when idiosyncrasy rules to such a degree and differences are so numerous that distinct factions are hard, even impossible to pin down," close quote. That struggle to find language adequate to the poetry of the present is, I think, symptomatic of the poetry of the present. The tools we have for organizing poetic production are 20th century tools. They are forged in the great conflicts of that period, above all in the poetry wars. And while 20th century traditions remain active in the present, 20th century methods for organizing the field no longer suffice. It is time to forge new tools, tools which will allow us to engage with the poetry of our time on its own terms, rather than those of an increasingly distant century. In telling the history of poetry over the past 30 years, I make 4 interconnected arguments. First, although there was a concerted attempt in the 1990s to reconcile the lyric and the avant-garde, that attempt failed. It did so for complicated reasons. In part, it proved difficult at that stage for poets to fully free themselves from the logic of the poetry wars. More importantly, and this is my second contention, the locus of confrontation between the lyric and the avant-garde shifted during that period. As poets were working to de-escalate the aesthetic conflict of the poetry wars, some of the leaders of the avant-garde redefined their antagonism as a political resistance to identity politics, which, in a rhetorical sleight of hand, became synonymous with the lyric. That transformation was never total, but in the stridency with which the position was proclaimed and through the prestige of those who proclaimed it, the critique of identitarian poetics became a leading, if not the leading, controversy of its time. That time has passed. For poets writing today, there is no reason not to write about identity if they so choose, and no reason not to use historically avant-garde techniques to do so. Hence my third and fourth claims. The opposition between the avant-garde and the poetics of identity has been superseded, and no new antagonism has emerged to take its place. That is, no new antagonism between the avant-garde and the lyric. The poetry wars are finally, truly over. What has sprung up in its place? How does the poetry of the present organize itself as a field? These questions have yet to be answered in a systematic way because they have yet to be posed. The transition to something new has happened quietly, without much hand-wringing or public comment. I should pause here to admit that this history excites a more than scholarly interest for me. I arrived, better washed up, in the poetry world in the early 2010s. Over the past 15 years, I have witnessed a profound transformation in the culture of American poetry, so much so that the questions and concerns I had as a young poet now seem unintelligible to me. My essay then is an attempt to explain to myself, if no one else, the history that I've lived through. In the past 10 years, I've watched with fascination and delight as the poets I admire most have invented something new, a model of poetic production that exceeds the binary framework of the poetry wars. If it has been difficult to recognize this poetry as a movement, that's because it isn't a movement. If you are looking for a manifesto, a school, a period style, you are asking the wrong questions. You are asking 20th century questions. Instead, contemporary poetry now is motivated by a shared set of political commitments which express themselves in a heterogeneous mixture of historically antagonistic poetic practices, which I call the poetics of solidarity. In the larger essay, I define that term through close readings of Layli Long Soldier's Whereas, as well as Andrea Abikaram and Kay Gabriel's We Want It All, an anthology of radical trans poetics. I don't have time today to get into those readings, but I'd like to briefly summarize what these texts have taught me about poetry and solidarity. We are, of course, not the first generation to demand a political meaning for our poetics, but after the poetry wars, it has become possible to make that demand in a more rigorous way. Instead of working within or against a false binary between the lyric and the avant-garde, the poets of the present engage with all the poetry being written now and judge it by its political creativity, its capacity to address the crises of the present. This is not an abstract judgment whose criteria can be defined in advance. Rather, it is a judgment that is made in communication with the work of a specific poet in a specific political circumstance. At its best, then, the poetics of solidarity affords the poets who work under its umbrella a much greater sense of aesthetic freedom than they would have enjoyed 30 years ago or 50. Any aesthetic is potentially welcome. Indeed, the pleasure of such a poetics is the way that it brings into conversation poets who share a sense of political urgency and little else. In brief, the poetics of solidarity is also the practice of solidarity. Thank you.
actually, hi, I'm Kayens. And then the essay that I wrote is actually sort of takes a very similar time period as Toby's. So a lot of the framing that Toby did is the same framing as mine. But what I want to track is like a different way that the lyric and the avant-garde are, I think, meeting each other in contemporary experimental poetics. And I've been, so the way to explain this, I've been sort of tracking two different things. Like I think there's a lot of contemporary experimental poets who are very interested in new narrative, and a lot of contemporary experimental poets who are very interested in like the tools and devices of language poetics and learning from them, who are of a generation that like didn't live through the poetry wars, have heard about it as a kind of anecdotal experience that older poets had. You know, I encountered it through, Fence was really important to me sort of coming into poetry in the mid-2010s as this place that like arose to allow poets that neither subscribed strictly to the lyric tradition nor to the post-language like syntax operations to undo the capitalist perception machine idea, but a place for poets in between. And so I was interested in that. And the movement that came out of that, that I think is most interesting is like the burlesque movement of the 2000s. Like Chelsea Minnis, Ariana Rines, Catherine Wagner, the poets I'm most interested in. And I think what I saw those poets doing was taking the concept of the lyric I and like understanding that as a performative gesture and building sort of structures out of this kind of performance that pointed towards the very kind of interstices of language that like Marjorie Perloff wrote about when she talked about language poetics and how like Ron Silliman or Leslie Scalapino or Lynn Hijinian were doing kind of language work. And I actually saw a strong correlation there. So I've been thinking about that a lot. And then I happened to see The Brutalist. And there's a very strange thing that happens with genre at the end of The Brutalist. Like for 7/8 of the movie, you think you're watching a kind of filmic Kunstlerroman, and then the whole style of the film changes. It becomes sort of didactic, bouncy, flat. It looks like you're watching an infomercial. And I was puzzled. And I didn't understand what had happened because I understood myself to be in a kind of genre contract with the film. So I talked to some friends who know more about Brady Corbet than I do, and they recommended I like watch Michael Haneke's Funny Games, which is where Brady Corbet kind of like came up as an actor. So in Funny Games, which is a story about it's from 2000 and he remade it in 2012. It's a story about two like teenage boys who trap a bourgeois family in their lake house, torture and eventually murder them. They move that family's belief about their own escape between like likely and unlikely. The film itself breaks the fourth wall repeatedly, reverses footage, direct address to the camera from the actors, all of these things that reveal the machinery of the genre film as machinery. But you're still like terrified, your feelings and your orientation and your affect move with the thriller as soon as the disruption is over, even though it happens repeatedly throughout the film. In an interview, Haneke says this is like what he's interested in. He's interested in revealing the power of genre to organize our feeling and orientation, even when the machinery is repeatedly revealed. So that was interesting to me, and I kept thinking about it with this poetics question of like, okay, what is it to like be an I and to reveal the machinery of the lyric as such? And then I watched Brady Corbet's earlier film Vox Lux, which is also a Kunstlerroman kind of like narrative of a pop star played by Natalie Portman, weirdly, who kind of like, there's a kind of opening sequence that's really different, and then Natalie Portman's career as it develops. But the whole time you're very aware that you're watching a genre film. Like, there are all of these scenes where there's like the kind of conversation the star should have with her daughter, and it goes on way too long to the point where it becomes kind of structureless, and you're like, what am I actually watching? There's no content here, but I'm really attuned to the structure that a conversation like this should happen now. And so seeing these films made me think like of three poets whose work I'd really been interested in, Steve Orth, Jennifer Song, and Xanta Perry, who are very different poets on the surface, but in different ways all of their work does this thing where you're continually interrogating, how am I relating to this I? And you're aware of the ways that different formulas of the lyric are being deployed in each of their three cases in very different ways. But this question of like, how am I making sense of what I'm reading? How am I orienting myself to this I? It's not overheard interior speech. It's performed interior speech that conforms to a certain genre of lyric expectation. And I think all of these poets know that in different, like Jennifer Song is using kind of like high romanticism lyric, a kind of fuzzy image of a high romantic lyric in my reading. Xanta Perry is using kind of like an Ed Dorn, Brodigan, kind of like 60s psychedelic cowboy type of thing, but that's continually revealing the language mechanics as it goes in this way that disrupts our relationship to this figure that we already recognize and know. And Steve Orth is using this kind of like modulation between irony and sincerity in a confessional mode, narrating kind of like ordinary life events. But in all cases, they're continually revealing the machinery, but you continue to like also try to be in relationship to this lyric I in a way that's similar to how you're continually trying to be in relation to the genre or thriller or like star narrative in a Brady Corbet film or a Michael Haneke film. And so there's something about this thinking of the I as a genre form that feels like it comes out of this like question of like how does concept and lyric meet each other, but it's a kind of different, it's a different intersection and one that takes performance and orientation as it's like kind of the place that this meeting happens. So my paper kind of like tracks that history out. It begins from Marjorie Perloff, kind of moves through Fence, Poetry Wars, the Burlesque, and then like tracks through these three poets thinking through these films as well. Yeah.
These are tough acts to follow. Nonetheless, I will try. So interestingly, it would make sense that a lot of what Ryan Eckes and I wrote about in a lot of ways is networks together a lot of what my co-presenters were talking about. Our paper is called Seeking the Commons Through Precarity and Crisis, American Poetics After 9/11. And Ryan Eckes and I are both, he's a very late Gen Xer and I'm a very ancient millennial. And so our paper is a sort of like mix of trying to think through our personal movement as poets through the poetry world and how certain kind of sociological factors and certain discourses of poetics sort of pushed against us or formed us and ended up putting us in this specific situation which we're in now. And also the background, of course, being just constantly being hit by economic crisis and sort of as a result, cultural crisis. And so we really move through a lot of different time periods starting with 9/11, and we expanded the frame a little bit because of our age. 9/11 is really like it really forms us as subjects. I mean, that's probably true for a lot of people here, but it's like, I was 18 and it was my first week of college and like, you know, we went to the campus center to watch the planes hit the tower. So that was, you know, that was like very defining. But through we cover a lot of ground, but sort of the patterns that we identify are this kind of hyper-gentrification of cities that totally shifts the possibility for a kind of more what we understood as an avant-garde poetics in the 20th century. We move through this kind of increased institutionalization of poetry around the 2008 economic crisis. We move through then the like Occupy Wall Street protests and how like after the 2008 crisis, there arises this really sharp sense of possibility. All of a sudden, after like the wasteland of the Bush years, the wasteland of the economic crisis, and then through to this sort of formation of a new poetics that is very much around funding and money, prize culture, the Poetry Foundation, and specifically like the Poetry Foundation and like the creation of like a new class of stars, which comes with, of course, the hyper commodification of identity. And then we end up, sort of moving towards the present. But one of the wagers of our essay is sort of like, there's so much about American life that has been forgotten, even things that happened 5 years ago. So what would it be like to really do an exercise in memory and remember what it was like what was it like being a baby poet in 2005? What was it like, being an adjunct like in the pandemic? Things like this. And so there's an experiential, like a heavily experiential quality to the kind of work that we're doing in the essay, but I think one of the questions that really underlies the earlier part of the essay that resonates with things that my co-presenters were talking about is sort of this question of like, what does it mean to write avant-garde poetics now? Does it even really matter? And there's this one anecdote that we include in the essay where it's in like 2006, and an old teacher of mine comes to be like a guest speaker in our MFA program, and she has like consultations with like the students, and she has a consultation with me, and she's like, I'm very disappointed in you, your poetry is not experimental anymore. But I think it's a really interesting thing to think about historically, because it is like there's about to be an economic crisis, and like the ground is very literally changing under our feet. And like, I think that at that point, I mean, I didn't understand it as such, I was just mad when it happened, but like ultimately I came to sort of now, like to think of historicizing it, is to realize that I was like a young writer trying to make something that made sense to the historical period when our very like sort of histories of poetics were kind of breaking down and changing. And so I feel like that moment was just like a moment where it's like, well, you can't really do a straight avant-garde poetics anymore. And I'm actually like, I mean, I guess I was both, I've always been torn. Like, I've always been like, okay, do I wanna be an avant-garde poet? Like, I don't know, probably, I guess I'm not. I really don't know, but I think this indecision in like actually the process of writing is something kind of really interesting about like history moving. And so that's just a little extemporaneous sampling of what we write about, but we cover a lot of ground, so.
Thank you everyone. I'm so excited. It's like watching something come to life is so exciting for your brilliant contributions. And before we move to audience participation and questions, I was wondering if any of our panelists wanted to ask each other a question or two, or respond to any ideas. Yeah.
Okay, I have a burning question for Brian. So, because it's a question that's deeply interesting to me too, and I think a lot about the kind of like problem Frederick Jameson raises about the difficulty of thinking totality and how kind of impossible it is in and after postmodernism. And you said this thing that in Assemblage Poetics you had sort of come to new possibilities for thinking totality. You have a book that I haven't read, I want to read it very soon, but I haven't read it yet. But I would love to hear you talk just a little bit more about like how poetry is thinking totality newly, just a little bit more about that.
Let's see. Well, thank you very much for the question. I would say, well, one of the inspiration for this book, I first conceived it by hearing a talk by Joshua Clover, and he has a great line, said, the epic is the poem that includes totality. Of course, that rips off of Ezra Pound's epic is a poem including history. And I do believe after economic crisis 2008, and then the global wave of struggles in 2011, and then that talk was given in 2011, it renewed the possibility of thinking totality in a material way. And of course, totality has the long tradition of philosophical tradition from Hegel and Marx and Jameson. And I think it really did renew the possibility of that and the importance of that. And certainly, yeah, a whole tendency from that was, or possibility for doing that came from poetry and poets. Interestingly, yeah. Why especially poetry became a privileged site for doing so remains still to be thought, I think. So yeah, and I'll take this opportunity to also riff off something that Nora said. The rhetorical question is avant-garde. Even, I think you said, like, is that even possible or even desirable? And I would say yes, it is important to do so. And I define avant-garde as opening new possibilities. And I'm not satisfied with the possibilities we have now. We have to invent some new ideas, new weapons. And I don't even see it as necessarily being agonistic either, poetry wars. It need not be, defined as a negative thing, against something. I see it more as opening new possibilities. So yeah, I want to throw my hat in with the put in the avant-garde.
I mean, so I agree with you, and I agree with you, and yet it's not going to look like the 20th century, it's not going to look like we all live in San Francisco and we all live in New York and we like have parties and everyone knows each other. Like, it just can't be that way because of like the massive sort of appropriation of public space and of all space by the ruling class. Like, we're really living in a time of like tremendous enclosure. So the question is like, how do you do a poetics of totality in a time of like complete full spectrum dominance enclosure? And for, one of the things that we write about later in the essay is sort of like, I think one major ground of possibility one major practice of possibility that we see in American poetics currently is the reading series as a form. Like, obviously, God bless publishing. And yet, publishing is, there's a lot of politics to publishing and a lot of politics that keep people out of publishing, even people with really brilliant work and really strong voices. And to me, like, as the co-curator of a reading series that I do with my friend Marta Nunez in Durham, it's been a real pleasure to have people read who otherwise haven't been able to be published, and they're doing work that we really believe in. And it's been amazing to see people's work grow. And like, ultimately our argument is that these networks are like sort of networks of survival, and that they're not equivalent to doing politics, but they're a ground from which organizational politics can grow in a sort of separate form. And so, like, it's just, I totally agree that that's where we need to be going. I just know that it just can't be in the old style.
I'll just say one thing, building off of what Laura was just saying. I just went on like a little bit of a rant about this on Blue Sky, so I apologize for those of you who already read this. But one of the things, I'm the director of a poetry center, and I feel like I have kind of an inside view of the economy of poetry. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is that economy is about to collapse, right? That we are really dependent and exposed because we depend on university funding, foundation funding, and that money is going away, and it's going away fast. So if your vision of your career was premised on small press publishing or academic publishing, if it was premised on receiving large reading fees, that's not what your career is going to look like in the next 4 or 5 years. So I think cultivating alternate modes of circulation, the reading series, the publishing collective, unionizing, like all of these things are really urgent tasks facing us, because I think we're like, in some ways, 2008 to 2025 will probably be seen as one historical period in poetry, and we're entering a new one because the economics of poetry is going to change so radically.
Yeah, and I totally in agreement. And this kind of fascinates me because I actually do think that we're on the edge of something really interesting. And to me, it's different because I'm not a person who's like perpetually excited about poetry, like, oh, goody goody poetry, like, at all. It's like, sorry, it's true. Like, I'm really excited right now. Like, I think that we're like living through an important historical moment in poetry, and it's because it's a moment of rupture. It's poetry's like radical delinking from the foundation economy, and unfortunately that will come for massive precarity for most of us. I say as someone who just got laid off from my publishing job, but like, cultural, hell yes, right on. But in terms of what opportunities that gives form and what opportunities that gives the form of community, I think it's a massive, significant rupture that opens up a lot of opportunities.
Yeah.
I love hearing all of you, and I'm teaching a lot of the poets that you're talking about in my classes, so it's like a breath of fresh air. I'm wondering, like, when you talk about like not looking at the 20th century models, maybe there are 20th century models of poets who are subversive in hostile political circumstances, like Tomasz Salomon and all those Central European poets, for instance. And historically, what satire was a way of looking at disparities and dealing with systematic shitheadedness and thinking about the unintentional consequences of your self-righteousness and things like that. Would that be political? Is anybody thinking along those lines?
I can address that question. I think the poetry, so I've written a lot about the poetry wars in this essay as though they were a real thing. But I think we can all agree that they were not. And I think one of the problems with the poetry wars as a way of framing the field is that it soaked up all the oxygen in the room and precluded other modes of poetic possibility from occupying center stage. And so one thing that I think is true of 20th century poetry, and Timothy Yu has said this, is that if you decouple your vision from centering the white poetry wars, you see a lot of alternate possibilities for thinking poetry and politics together. And as the poetry wars have dissolved as a framework, those other ways of thinking about poetry and politics have occupied center stage, the place where they always belonged. So I think there are really useful models from the 20th century. The influence of Amiri Baraka on contemporary poets, I think, is a good example of this, that are kind of re-emerging and being reevaluated in the present. And that seems like a really healthy thing for the field.
Yeah, I think about like conflict in poetry, and I'm sorry if this is beyond the scope of that particular conflict of like lyric and avant-garde, but when I think about poetic solidarity, I was wondering what you all thought about sort of contemporary conflict, contemporary reviled poetic movements like Insta Poets or the remnants of spoken word that sort of remain in cities and remain racialized, and how that fits into conflict and solidarity, and in the Canadian industry for that matter.
I have a preliminary stab. I mean, like, I actually think that we're in a moment where poetry is like really weirdly culturally relevant in a way that I've never experienced in my whole life. And I think part of that is Instagram poetry. And I think that that's really important. I do think that maybe in method there's some antagonism between like the kind of poetries that we're talking about, which very much are in a tradition, we're talking about like the post-avant-garde tradition or whatever. But I don't think, I think the interesting thing about this moment is that they don't have to be an antagonism, which opens a lot of possibilities. And of course there's individuals who'll be like, that's stupid, that's bad, but like it's not really relevant in a way, people aren't more experimentalist poets aren't like, well, I'm this because I'm not an Instagram poet, or I don't think, that's, my perception isn't that.
I was really intrigued by the phrase that the economy of poetry, and you guys talked about that, and particularly about the relevance of the economy of poetry in their collapse, like 2008-2009, that collapse would be the further collapse. And to my mind, what that suggests and pretty much promises is that, as university funding evolves, as less and less people are able to engage in art or whatever. Also, as university funding becomes complicit, as thugs in uniforms, and they have to start dragging students out of universities and detaining them, possibly white university funding is predicated on that kind of Nazism. So I guess, what this also means is that privatization is going to be the new poetry economy. That has its own risks and that has its own perils. So I I guess I'm wondering what you guys think about that, and if you see any ways of kind of reconciling with this like kind of hyper-fascism or privatization, with the more like softer sort of edge of, what the university is presenting that.
These are all really important concerns, and I'll just sort of speak a little bit, just as someone who started a journal completely independent of like donors, completely independent of, I'm not independently wealthy myself, I'm not interested in getting, and even incorporating as a nonprofit, I'm not interested in getting money or sponsorship from the university. I'm kind of interested in what forms of like collectivized thinking can happen independently of these things. And I think to speak to something that Toby was addressing too, like we have an opportunity, and everybody in there are speaking to this in this way, for either, intentional divestment or unintentional divestment, right? And that is, I think, the defining feature of like kind of the precipice that literally surrounds us now, right? And so that, the conflict, I mean, it's something I guess it is a 20th century conflict in the sense as more and more small press culture became tied to university sponsorship, there are sort of ways in which like complicities are inevitable, right? And so the ways that we are sort of finding opportunities outside of that, I think are going to be the way that we have to move forward. But I think that that's our time. It's an impossible topic to cover all in one short panel. I want to thank our panelists again for their amazing presentation. Editorial decision to not bookmark this folio as being a time-stamped folio, and I'm going to continue to have it open to continue the conversation around thinking about this period. So the opportunity to submit your thoughts or essays or query Annulet on this regard will remain open in perpetuity. So thank you all.